Hi, Rob.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing good. How about you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is, in fact, the Wright Show. You are Rob Kurzban, professor of psychology at Penn and the author of this book, Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite, the subtitle being Evolution in the Modular Mind. Okay. And it's a really great book. And I've talked to you about it before, but never on camera. And it does have a theory as to why everyone is a hypocrite. And it also sheds light on such things as self-control, why we lack it, how we might get it, and also on moral debates and things like that. So covers a lot of territory, but it all rests on this this phrase in the subtitle, the modular mind, right?
Yeah, that's right. So first of all, thanks for the kind words about the book, and that's right. So one of the big themes that underlies the whole thing is this idea that the mind consists of a large number of parts, which, I just want to be clear is not original with me. A bunch of people have had this idea, including people like Jerry Fodor and a whole bunch of others after him.
Okay. And how do you, for people who aren't familiar with it, how do you flesh that out? The idea that our minds are modular. How does that differ from what might be our common sense conception of how our minds are structured?
I think a lot of people have this idea, this intuitively, that there's one big sort of me inside, a big general kind of amorphous self. And the modular view suggests that there's lots of different pieces that are more or less active at different times. And so you can think of the mind a little bit like you might think of a toolbox or a pocket knife or an iPhone. Different metaphors have been used at different times that has all these different little functional bits inside of them. And so this intuition that there's sort of a me in there runs sort of counter to this other idea that there's lots of different bits of the self in there that are more or less in control at different moments.
Okay, so are you saying that the me that I think of as me is not in control, the Bob?
Yeah, so I sort of think of the me that you think of as Bob as a little bit more like a press secretary or public relations department, which is sort of broadcasting things out into the world that are useful for Bob, maintaining your reputation and so on. But really, there's a lot of decision-making going on that you have no conscious access to, that none of us sort of really know about. So what this means is that we don't always understand the motives behind our own actions. And this unitary sense of self is more, again, this kind of broadcast medium as opposed to all these different bits and pieces that are doing the actual work.
Okay, so are there like examples of this where like I might think of myself as being in control or think of myself as making a decision and you might describe it another way?
Yeah, I mean, the experimental literature in psychology is filled with such examples where we can run an experiment where we know what's driving someone's choice, and then you ask people about the origin of their choices, and they give answers that can't possibly be right. So in consumer psychology, there are studies in which people are shown identical products and asked to pick one that they like best. And we know because of the experimental setup that what's going on is that people are choosing based on the position of the object as opposed to their properties. But if you ask them, they say that they're choosing based on these properties. So there's a case where people just don't know why they're choosing what they choose.
So you mean what? Like people are more likely to buy laundry detergent that's at the left end of the shelf, or what?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But they might not know why they're doing it. I mean, that's sort of the distinction, right? So the position is driving the choice, or the color, or something like that, as opposed to some important consumer property. Yeah.
Okay. And a big kind of milestone, I think, in this worldview came some time ago with these split brain experiments, right? And these were experiments with people who were not actually, in a sense, didn't have a normal brain, but nonetheless, you, in your book, you emphasize their importance, right? Do you want to talk about those a little?
Yeah, I think those studies are really important. And as you say, we should be careful about how much weight we put on them because these are not normal brains. But again, they illustrate some phenomena that are true of normal brains. So in those studies, you can show the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere of the brain different images, and then the other hemisphere doesn't know what the opposite hemisphere saw. And then you can do tasks which sort of ask each hemisphere to point at a related object. But to me, the really important part of that study is that after the pointing is done and the split brain patient is asked to explain their choices, they make something up. They basically tell a story that makes their choices seem reasonable and logical.
And they believe the stories. So
yeah, they're not lying. I mean, that's one of the things is that when people are making up these stories, it's not as though they're dissembling. It's quite genuine.
So in the classic setup, so again, these are people whose the connection between the hemispheres was severed for therapeutic reasons, and it's a kind of complicated arrangement that is required so that they're feeding some visual information only into the left eye, which means it only goes to the right brain, and so too with auditory information. I guess they can give commands or something, but anyway, so they can communicate with one hemisphere or the other. They tell somebody, get up and walk toward the door. They tell the right brain that, right? And then they say to the person, where are you going? And the person comes up with an explanation, and this would be the left brain, because the left brain does the talking, right? And they say, I'm going to get a soda or something, and they really believe it.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about this literature is it makes our pronouns tricky. So when you say they really believe it, another way to put that is, the hemisphere that's creating the story has a genuine belief about its motive, even though that can't be that's not the right answer to the motive, right? So, but that's exactly right. And I think, people like Mike Zanig and others who have talked about the interpreter are sort of trying to get across this idea that that brains contain these systems that seem to want to concoct narratives that make our behavior seem sensible and logical, even if they don't have access to the actual underlying decision-making process.
Okay. And this would be an example of, this left hemisphere would I guess, be where you think this press agent, or a lot of the press agent self, is located. Although, again, in a normal person, there is presumably intercommunication between left and right hemisphere. But anyway, what we see in these experiments is I guess, the part of the brain whose job is to make you seem like this in-control person who doesn't just get up and walk someplace for no reason, right? That's the press agent coming up with a valid reason for having done something.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't take a strong position on where these things are located in the brain. As you say, once you start getting into these clinical cases, things are a little bit more ambiguous. So it could be that in a normal brain, the locations differ from what happens with what's going on in some of these clinical cases.
Okay, and you mentioned, it's kind of, you said the pronouns get tricky, and in your book, you do say that you're reluctant to say things even like, he believes X, right? Now, flesh out what would be wrong with that. I mean, if I feel right now this belief, what's a good example of a belief? I believe the Republicans are responsible for all that's evil or something, or I believe that I'm gonna go skiing tomorrow. What's wrong with saying that I'm the one that holds those beliefs?
Well, I think for some purposes it's fine. So I think for kind of everyday conversation, it's perfectly fine for you to say that about the Republicans. But I think that as a scientific matter, the problem is that it could be that some of these representations, so beliefs are one kind of representation, they don't spread out. They don't get into other modules. The examples that I think illustrate this most clearly are the visual illusions, where you have one part of your brain that perceives X, Y, or Z to be the case. So I have the shading illusion in the book. Yeah. And then you have another part of the brain that knows that the part of the brain that's doing the perceiving is getting it wrong. So the sort of part of your brain that perceives those colors in this illusory way, there's an important sense in which that part of the brain just doesn't believe the same thing that the other part of the brain does. So if you believe that, if it's true that some representations don't move from one bit of the brain to the other, as they don't, for example, in split brain patients that you were alluding to earlier, then making this claim that the belief sort of spreads out and gets everywhere, it kind of runs into this problem where it might not be true.
Yes.
And so to the extent,
sorry, I'm just showing people this illusion you're talking about, okay? Where the shading illusion, where these two things labeled A and B, which seem to be a very clearly different shades, are in fact not. They are the same shade, and you can prove it to yourself by isolating them and comparing them, right? But then how does that? But you still that doesn't change the way you see it, right? Is that the point?
Right, that's right. So the part of your brain that's building the percept, in this particular case, doesn't change the way it represents the information, doesn't change what it looks like, simply because you have propositional knowledge that the two are in fact the same. So your visual part of the brain or your perceiving part of the brain, that thing is resistant to this kind of top-down information. And I just want to be clear here that that's not always the case. There's reverse cases where top-down information can actually change the percept. So I like these examples where once you, for example, hear words in a set of syllables, you can't sort of unhear them. You can't not hear the words in the string of syllables. It actually does sort of go from the top down into the perception. So the important point there is that it is possible but not necessary that top-down information can stay isolated from that it might not affect what's going on at the perceptual level.
Mm-hmm. But that, in any event, is an example where these two kind of modules stubbornly maintain incompatible beliefs about something.
Yeah, and exactly. And I mean, my view is that there's lots of stuff like that the perception world is a nice world to illustrate the basic case, but that there's plenty of places in the mind where you're going to have conflicting beliefs and at sort of higher levels of cognition. Okay,
so are there some other ones that are worth talking about, or?
Well, I mean, some of my favorites are so scientists with religious beliefs are always sort of interesting to me, where on the one hand, there seems to be some parts of their brain that have, sets of supernatural beliefs, and then other parts of the brain that are resisting it. Mm-hmm. I think there's plenty of examples of this kind of conflict. Again, I think the ones that become most clear are the perceptual examples, because they're the persistence of the representation, the fact that you keep seeing it mm-hmm. as different shades. I feel like those are the most illustrative.
Now with the scientists, the kind of religious scientists, some of them might describe it as a distinction between kind of reason and feeling or something, right? They might say, well, when push comes to shove, I feel the presence of God or something, but I don't actually quite think that way, right? I mean, but would you not accept that kind of distinction? You would want to get more modular than that?
I mean, I think that there's lots of ways that people try to justify what it seems to others that are mutually incompatible beliefs. And mm-hmm. And so people will run circles around themselves trying to make the contradictions seem, to make sense. I mean, so as you probably know, and well, I'm sure you know, I'm interested as well in sort of moral issues, where again, I think you can spot fairly easily these cases of contradictions where, so for example, abortion is always on the top of people's minds, and so people say that the reason that they're pro-life, for example, might be because they think that life begins at conception, and then some of these same people will say that they think that there should be exceptions for cases of rape and incest. And, if you then ask them, well, is it okay to kill a 2-year-old who it turns out was the result of rape or incest? They say, no, of course not. Well, so what that means is that the reason behind their moral justification can't really be that they think that the fetus has the same status as the 2-year-old child. It has to be something else. So there's some kind of disjunct there between, what someone believes in terms of the justification for their moral stance and what I think is really the justification for their moral stance. But I agree with you that people can spin stories that try to reconcile those kinds of things. But I think for me, the kind of explanation where it's just that you've got different systems that are doing their thing is the more satisfying kind of explanation.
Okay. Now on this, so I guess one question is, I mean, I have this conception of the self, myself. I mean, the typical person does, at least, leaving aside my own views. And let's just make sure I understand what the different things you think are that are wrong with the standard view. I mean, can you list I mean, first of all, what are things that are not true of what we call the self, in your view, that are commonly thought to be true?
Well, I mean, part of my resistance to this notion of self is not exactly located in the lay conception of the self. A lot of it has to do with the way the term is used in the psychological literature. So what you're seeing there is a reaction to that. So, for example, people use the self as a kind of an explanatory entity in psychological theories, and that, I think, is probably going to turn out not to be right. As if there is this central unitary controller of these lots of different kinds of processes. So I think that for me, this notion that there's one kind of central guy in charge that explains, why people do what they do in a wide variety of circumstances, I think that's probably not going to turn out to be right. Instead, what you need is an explanation that makes reference to lots of different things going on in lots of different in different times, and depending on what the context is. So, if you look in psychology, this notion that the self does this, the self does that, my sense is that that's not going to turn out to be a useful kind of explanatory entity, that in order to get good explanations, you're going to have to break it down quite a bit further than that into different bits and pieces.
Okay. And that is also kind of the lay conception of the self, right? We think of ourselves as the CEOs of the show, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, an interesting question that I don't really know what the answer to is, why is that? So why do we all seem so confident that there is one central author of our actions that persists through time, and it's the same guy that, was there when I was a kid, and it's going to be there when I'm an adult, or I guess when I'm an old person, and that it has this persistence over time. And certainly feels that way. I mean, I get that. Like, I feel that way too. I feel like there's a me in there somewhere. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it seems to, in a way, follow from the idea that its function is to be the press agent, right? I mean, if it's in our interest to present a story about ourselves as these coherent, in-charge individuals guided by a consistent set of values, then, if that's the story it makes sense for you to present, then that's the story it makes sense for you to believe, and that is the story of a coherent, in-charge self, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think you put your finger on something which I think is really important, which is that these stories that we spin are basically responding to the fact that other people value certain kinds of things in others. For example, they want other people to be logical, consistent, coherent, predictable, and so on. This means that the stories you spin have to have those properties. I mean, you could imagine a world in which it's not like that, where we just like random people who are, unpredictable for whatever reason. But that's not the world we live in. And so the stories that we spin tend to have these properties that make us kind of good sort of social agents, that make us coherent and parsable and understandable and comprehensible. And so exactly as you say, I think that's what the press agent is up to. It's sort of making us appear as though we're good people to have around, because there's at least this consistency that enables other people to predict what we're going to be like and what we're going to do tomorrow, because it's going to be a little bit like what we did yesterday.
Right. And in fact, I guess the person who said, basically, so I contradict myself, so what? I think it was Walt Whitman, right?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it's such a weird thing to say that he's famous, for having said it, among other things, of course. Yeah. But I mean, it's so unusual for someone to say, so what? I contradict myself, that you can go down in history for having said it. Okay.
I mean, it's sort of interesting that it's an artist.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I was saying it's sort of interesting that, right, you have to, the person you got famous for it was someone in the arts, right? So it's okay to be a little bit crazy if you have the ambiance of arts surrounding you, I think.
Maybe that's right. Okay, so then tell me what's wrong with this common way of describing a situation involving me. Okay, I really wanted to have the chocolate, and I really felt drawn to it, but I knew that if I did it today, I'd do it tomorrow, the next day. The next day, eventually, I'd gain weight, and I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I, ate so much chocolate. And so I decided not to eat the chocolate. Now, you think that's an inaccurate way of describing what's actually going on in my brain, right?
Yeah, I think that from a lay standpoint, it's fine to talk like that. When you're talking to your, family at the dinner table, it's fine. But I think eventually psychology as a scientific enterprise is going to have to move on from sentences that have pronouns like that. So if those sentences are going to have to be something like, there were certain systems in your head which are designed to be motivated to eat high-calorie foods, and those systems had certain kinds of, you can call them motives or beliefs or whatever, representations. And then there's other parts of your head that have motives associated with long-term health. And those systems had certain beliefs about the chocolate and what's a good thing to bring about. And so those modules inhibited, the behavior that was being facilitated by the short-term modules. And so, in that description, there's no word I in there. There's no pronouns that are sort of covering the whole self. There's little individual modular systems that have beliefs, desires, motivations, representations about the world, representations about other modules, and so on. And I feel like that's going to turn out to be a much cleaner way. Well, cleaner in the sense of it'll be accurate, but it'll be a bit messier in the sense of it kind of cuts across the grain in terms of our intuitive way of referring to ourselves with pronouns like I. So I think that it doesn't make a lot of sense to say I both wanted and didn't want to eat chocolate. It's not clear what that I refers to, but it makes a lot of sense to say some part of my brain is driving me to consume chocolate and a different part of my brain is inhibiting those desires and those behaviors. I think that makes perfect sense.
Now, one virtue, though, of talking the old-fashioned way is it seems to account for how one side was victorious, right? You think of yourself as being like a judge who's deciding between two parties and renders a ruling. We've seen that happen in real life. It resolves the dispute. One party wins, one party loses. If that's not what's going on in your view, if there kind of is no me to do that, how is the conflict getting resolved? How does the short-term or long-term module prevail?
So I think of this as really modular fights. So I think that these guys, one way to think about it, and I'm not saying this is exactly right, but it certainly eliminates the need for an arbiter in there, is that these different modules are sort of fighting for control of the muscles, or fighting for control of behavior. And when one sort of system wants to get its way, what it does is it sort of inhibits the other one from sending signals to the muscle systems, or it inhibits the action of the other one, or does something else, so that the modules themselves are doing the fighting without there having to be some sort of third party that's making the ultimate decision. So there's no judge. It's just that the two parties are fighting with each other until one wins. And I think that, and I don't want to say this too strongly because it's not my specialty area, but there's lots of models of what's going on in the brain that have that kind of feel to it, where there's systems that are doing their thing, and one system sort of winds up winning, not because it's chosen, but because its activation is higher than the other systems, and its activation inhibits the activation of other systems. So I think that kind of story, that kind of approach has some appeal in the sense that it connects up to other ways in which we think psychological systems work.
Right. Although it is the experience of most people that there are ways to, over time, create patterns in terms of which one wins, right? You learn self-discipline or something. There seem to be things that you can do, or maybe you would say things that can happen to you, or things that can happen, that make one side stronger and one side weaker, right?
Yeah, totally. And not just that, but you can change your environment in such a way. So this is why I like, Chip Heath has this book, Stick, which in some ways is all about ways in which the long-term part of your head can build an environment that makes the short-term drives have a disadvantage. So, suppose you're doing a blogging head and you want to make sure you don't get tempted to check your email. What you can do is you can throw your cell phone off to the side of the table where you can't reach it to see if anything interesting has come in during the conversation. So that sort of is a way to make the short-term modules that kind of want to know what's going on. It puts them at a disadvantage relative to the long-term modules that want to keep your attention on the business at hand. So, and of course you're right that people change over the course of their lives and become either more less long-sighted through practice and getting reinforced about the benefits of being patient and so on. I totally agree with that.
Okay. And what do you think is going on when, in the course of making a big decision like whether to eat chocolate or not, I entertain rationales for doing it or not doing it that go beyond the obvious, right? It's not just, oh, it'll taste good, oh, you'll gain weight, oh, it'll taste good, oh, you'll gain weight. You start getting these secondary arguments like, well, you've worked really hard today, you deserve it. Or, wait, you remember what happened last time, right? So these are among the things that sustain the idea that actually it's like an adjudicatory process, right? So what do you think, how are these reasons who's generating these ideas in my brain if it's not me?
Well, right. So that's a great question. And the short answer is I don't know. But it seems like they're coming from different modular systems that are trying to figure out what to do. But I think there are probably two different things going on. And I think you probably have this in mind. And the first one is that if you've got different modules that want to go in different directions, eating chocolate versus not, then the system sort of wants to figure out what the best move is. And so it's got to sort of use all of its resources, which is coming up with reasons for and against. I mean, I think that's the way lots of decision making goes, is you sort of consult long-term memory, you do some information seeking, all this kind of stuff, and the different modules are sort of fighting for their team. Each module, or these sets of modular systems, are responsible for kind of figuring out how much they should be pushing for their particular decision. But I think there's a second thing, and here I think Hugo Mercier's paper against Sperber is really nice, which is that people want to come up with reasons to justify their behavior to other people. Again, this goes back to this public relations thing. So the production of reasons inside your head, my guess is that a large part of the reason that goes on is because if someone ever challenges you or asks you why you did X, Y, or Z, you want to have that in your hand. And you don't want to take actions until you have some reason ready to go, such that if people ask you about it, so if the social world pings you and says, what was the story with that you have something ready to go. I think this is why, the marketing people are telling me that consumers need only one reason to buy a product. Is that basically it's not that one reason dominates all the other features of the product, the price or the quality or the whatever, the brand, who knows. But it's that as long as you have one reason, you can't look like an idiot for making the choice. You can always tell the other guy who asks you why you bought that particular microwave. You say, yeah, well, it has the gizmo thing feature, which, is something that really mattered to me.
So you would imagine, I gather, that the generation of these rationales, like, oh, you've worked hard today, you deserve it. That reason would actually be generated by or recruited by, you might say, the short-term module. That's kind of the active agent in the generation of this rationale.
That wouldn't be surprising to me. I think, as you can kind of imagine, we're just scratching the surface of these modular systems. It's going to try to be really complicated. So I wouldn't want to commit too heavily to exactly which jobs are done within which systems and which ones are shared and so on. But yeah, I think that there are separate sort of entities that are marshaling different kinds of evidence and throwing them into working memory in the service of getting the things that they sort of, well, in quotation marks, want or motivate or are designed to bring about.
And in that sense, the rationale is kind of more than a retrospective rationale that had no causal effect, because you can imagine it being the case, right, that, hey, if you're not going to be able to defend this to the public with a reasonable rationale, then the cost-benefit calculus works against this, and it actually doesn't make sense to do it, right? So in that sense, reason of a sort could be decisive in the calculation of what to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not trying to say that reasons and cost-benefit computations aren't driving decisions. I absolutely think they are. I guess what I'm saying is that they're certainly not the only thing and may not even be the primary thing. Certainly the first part of that. I think there's plenty of evidence that what's going on in terms of again, cost-benefit computations and so on, that those things are really important. I'm just saying that you shouldn't necessarily take people's words for it in terms of what they're up to and what the basis for their decisions was. There could be other stuff going on that they don't have conscious access to.
Okay. So the self that I think of as myself, okay, you would say there's some properties I may think it has that it doesn't have, mainly it being the CEO that's really initiating all the action, making all the decisions. You would say that's wrong, but it is something, right? This center of consciousness that I feel, it is something, right? How would you describe what it actually is?
Oh, I mean, that's a pretty deep question, so I'd be reluctant to describe what it actually is. I mean, I sort of think of it really as something like a press agency, which is it gets this information that's useful in order to justify behavior and so on, and then it puts that information out into the world. I mean, people have been talking about consciousness and so on for a while, and I'm not, many lots of people think that various parts of that question are insoluble. But I do think that a really important part of its job is going to be to disseminate information to the rest of the world that's good for the person to put out there. I'm not saying that's the only function of consciousness. I mean, I also think that you could kind of think of the conscious stuff that's going on as something like a mental workspace that takes in different bits of information and weighs it in the kind of way that you were alluding to earlier. The thing is that, consciousness is hard. So understanding what's going on, I think, is challenging. But I do think that persuasion and narrative is a pretty important part of it, following people, again, like Dennett and Gazzaniga, and others who have taken this position in the past.
But you would ultimately consider the thing I think of as the self that's kind of in charge. You would consider just another module with whose function is kind of communication with the world out there. But aside from that, is not necessarily to be ranked above some other modules in my brain.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's anything special about it. I think that, again, people have this intuition that there's a sort of executive, and we talk about executive function and so on. But yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like the stuff that you're conscious of is just another set of modules in your head doing a job, and there's reason to privilege them in some sense, right? Those are pretty special modules that are really cool. But in terms of decision making and so on, no, I wouldn't necessarily give them any particular weight.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's possible that there are modules within me that are themselves conscious? I'm just not in touch with them. I mean, could there be independent spheres of consciousness, of sentience, that aren't part of my overall what I feel right now as my stream of consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, whenever you talk about stuff like that, it almost feels as though you've drifted into metaphysics or some kind of really interesting hallucinogen-induced speculation. But I don't see any reason to think that it's not possible that there's these conscious modules in your head that are just not connected up to the other conscious modules. I mean, if you ask yourself, what would that be like? What would it be like if there were some part of my head that was conscious but wasn't connected up to the part that's talking to you now? I think the answer to that is kind of like, well, it wouldn't be like anything. You just wouldn't be aware of it. Or that is, the bit that's conscious wouldn't be aware of the other bit that's conscious. So I always find that kind of scary. It reminds me of that, there was that nice film whose name escapes me with Robin Williams about these Parkinson's patients. And it also kind of reminds me.
I think Awakenings or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. Where basically, you have this dialogue that sort of gets people to think about what would it be like if there was, a conscious experiencing entity inside a paralyzed body. A little bit like, what it would be like to have a locked-in patient or something like that. And I think it's scary, but by the same token, it doesn't seem impossible to me.
Yeah, this comes through in Gazzaniga's description of the split brain experiments. That he kind of, you get the sense he's thinking that the right brain, when it's separated from the left, may have its own realm of consciousness. And when you think about it, I mean, in those experiments, the command to get up and walk out of the room was, in a sense, heard and comprehended. And we know that normally when your brain isn't split, that's part of consciousness, the hearing and the comprehension. And so, it could be, that once you split the two things up, you've got these two spheres of consciousness, I guess. But you're always talking, the experimenter is always hearing from only one of them.
Yeah, actually, now that you say it out loud, I'm embarrassed I didn't come up with that myself. That's right. So I think the split brain patients are a good example where within the same skull, you've got two brain things that are presumably conscious and yet not sharing consciousness with each other. And again, what is it like to be a left brain that doesn't have access to the right brain? It's, it's just whatever it's like to be a left brain. So that, I think, is a great example of this existence proof of having multiple conscious entities in the same skull, right, that don't share the experiences. And so if you're willing to concede that that's sort of such a case, then yeah, it seems to me that there could, for all we know, complicated nervous bits in our spinal cords might have phenomenology, right? It could be like something to be a spinal cord, but the rest of the nervous system could never talk about it because it's not connected up to the spinal cord.
And I kind of wonder, you talk about crazy metaphysical speculation, but could it be that, from time to that in a way to compete for control. Well, I don't know that in the course of competing for control, maybe some of these modules, they temporarily merge with consciousness, and that becomes kind of the battleground or something. It's like maybe there's this part of me that's always longing for a chocolate bar, but it only gets access to my consciousness when a candy bar shows up or something. I don't know if that makes sense, but in other words, the conventional thing to say would be, well, I'm aware at different times of different parts of me. There's the lustful part of me. There's the studious part of me. There's the left foot that I'm only aware of when it hurts. But conceivably another way to describe some of these things would be, well, that's when their consciousness merges with yours, or is this sounding too crazy?
No. I mean, I totally endorse this. I think this is totally right. I think that if you're going to take these ideas seriously, then it could very well be that what is experienced as conscious does change in exactly the way you're talking about. That sort of what gets put into the pool of consciousness changes with situational variables and contextual variables and various kinds of stimuli. And so, as you say, it sort of goes down the rabbit hole into crazy talk. But, if that's the way the mind works, if there's all these different systems that sort of come in and out of relevance and therefore come in and out of consciousness, then that's just the way it is. The thing about the brain is that it's way more complicated than we'd like it to be, right? So that is to say, in order to understand it. And so lots of things which are crazy about the brain have turned out to be, at least they look like they're going to turn out to be true. I talk about a little bit at least about the Libet studies, or Libet as some people say. Right. So those, in that study, people are told to move their hand and to report when they made the decision, and the nervous activity is recorded, and the nervous activity for the decision begins before the report of when the choice is made. And what that means is that some bit of the brain that you're not aware of was making this decision, quote unquote, for you. And, in some ways that had to be the case, or at least I think many of us figured it had to come out like that. But it's also spooky, right? So in other words, there's some part of your brain that's doing its job without the quote unquote you, the experiencing you, sort of having made the decision of running the show or even knowing about it until after the fact. And so things like that, I think, should tell us that things are going to might turn out to be pretty weird in the kind of weird way that you've been describing.
Yeah, I always wondered about those experiments because, as I gather, it's like they say, tell us when you've decided to push the button or something like that, and you tell them, and they, how does it work exactly?
You tell them, so you make the muscle movement and you tell them when you made the decision to move the muscle, to start to whatever. And the clock said.
And they discern through some sort of technology that the muscles were actually moving before you made the decision.
The brain activities
before you were
that
aware
were
of making. Go ahead.
So, the brain bits that were going to be telling the muscles to move, they were doing their job before people say that they made their decision, as measured by the little clock that they've got up or what have you.
But couldn't that be accounted for by a delay in the by how long it takes to get from the decision to the speech that describes the decision?
Yeah, I don't think that those experiments lock it down completely, and they don't eliminate alternative explanations, including these kinds of failures of measurement. But I think many people take it at face value, and if it is taken at face value, then it does. People say, it looks like the decision was made before the person or whatever. So the reporting entity was able to report on it. But sure, I think that you could come up with alternative explanations. None of these things are going to lock stuff down completely.
I assume there's now been a chain of these experiments, I think, since Libet did the original one. I would think they've hashed this out. And I never hear anyone raising the question that I have, so maybe they have figured out a way to correct for that somehow. So anyway, you think that for the reasons we've covered, that it's kind of wrong to say there are cognitive biases, right? We suffer from cognitive biases, or we are, or whatever, right? What is wrong with describing? Let's say, what are some standard cognitive biases? I guess people, attribute, when they see attractive people, they assume they're smarter than unattractive people or something like that. There are these various things, right? But why is it wrong to say that's a bias on my cognition?
Well, so, I mean, I guess I don't resist the notion of bias quite as strongly as you're suggesting I do. I think that in some cases, what's looked like a bias to some people, to me, looks like it's something which can be perfectly reasonably understood on the basis of whatever the job of the mechanism in question is. But so bias is usually used with respect to some normative theory, which is useful for lots of purposes, and I'm not really trying to run up against that characterization. All I'm trying to say is that when the brain is doing something that at first looks funny, it could very well be that it's doing something useful. But to do something useful, you just have to violate whatever the relevant normative theory is. So in terms of that particular one that you mentioned, I don't know as much about this as I know about some other stuff. But in such a case, it could very well be that it's true, for example, that people who are more, people should just, it's not unreasonable to expect people to go with base rates. And there could be other reasons having to do with, how people are sampling from the world or what have you. But if it turns out that that's not true, but people do make the inference, then in that case, I am perfectly happy to call it a bias. That's fine.
Mm-hmm. But you have kind of a similar issue with the term self-deception, like especially if I say, like, I deceive myself.
Yeah, that now there I do take a strong position. So there I think that talking about self-deception is really not very useful. And I say that with a certain amount of trepidation because, as you know, Bob Trivers, he thinks it is very useful. And so Bob is, a pretty smart guy. So I'm a little bit reluctant to find myself in disagreement with him. But right, I think the language of self-deception is not going to be helpful. And this runs into the problem with which you started this sort of blogging head, which is this notion of the problems of talking about the self. So if I'm deceiving myself, I think that's, as an ontological matter, it's very difficult to figure out how to pay that out in anything that would be sensible. So who's the I? What's the myself? I think there's much better ways to think and to talk about it than to say something like I'm deceiving myself. I don't even know what that might mean.
But you would be willing to say there is a module that is not sharing information with the conscious public relations module, right? And some people,
yeah.
So you might say module A is deceiving module B, and module B is what I think of as myself.
Yeah, although that does a little bit of violence to the notion of deception. So if I don't pass true information to you, am I deceiving you? Maybe. It depends on how people want to use the word. But yeah, I think you've got it exactly right, that it's perfectly reasonable to say some modules are designed not to pass information on to another module, and so there's something that can be interesting there, right? So that the module that's doing the talking is not going to have access to the best possible estimate of what's true, because this other module didn't share information with it by virtue of its design not to do so. And then that's fine. So that's a case where you are potentially going to have these conflicting beliefs in your head, right? So I think that's a more useful way to put it, is to say, you have a true belief nestled in your head somewhere, and then you have this false belief which you're using for propaganda purposes. Those two beliefs are different from each other. And I don't think there's anything to be gained by calling that self-deception. I think that the language of representations and encapsulation is a much kind of tidier way to talk about that.
Okay, so then your view of your life is like, I'm sure you, on the one hand, have the kind of sense that the conscious you is like doing all this stuff, but your actual belief is that your conscious self is doing something a little more like, I don't know, watching a movie or observing the play, the interplay of forces more than controlling them, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we're more than observers, we're sort of participant observers. The conscious self is sort of getting information and then maintaining various kinds of, it's in the propaganda business, so it's got to do a bit more than observe. But, right, the author of actions and behaviors are things that our conscious selves don't have access to, which is, a little irritating.
And how does this affect your everyday life? Walking around with this conception of your, if you'll forgive me, self?
Well, I mean, I tend to be a little bit more forgiving of myself, as it were, again, with apologies for the language, for doing otherwise puzzling things. So I tend to be more willing than I think I otherwise would to sort of go with whatever my intuitions are. So, for example, my priorities in terms of my work stuff I don't always know why I put some stuff on the top of my list and some stuff on the bottom. And I just have this sort of faith, if you will, that somehow there's little systems in my head that are making good decisions about what I ought to turn to next. So, and I think I wouldn't feel that way quite as strongly if I didn't have this worldview that there were smarter people than the conscious me. And when I say people, I really mean modules, that are doing the heavy lifting in terms of figuring out what I ought to be doing. So I'm more forgiving of my intuitions about, what my plans are, what my priorities are, and so on. I think it comes with a certain sort of, it's easier to forgive yourself for making mistakes when, which I do all the time, of course, when there's all these little systems in there which are doing their own little thing and you don't really know what they're up to.
Right. But if you trust them, as you were just saying, that if you kind of assume that things are more or less under control, how valid is the basis for the assumption that you can trust them? I mean, of course, they have this track record of having kept you alive and productive so far. But there are people who would have a sufficiently cynical view of natural selection's agenda that they would say, well, certainly, like in an ethical sense, you can't trust them, right? Or I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to push it too far. You're exactly right that you can't sort of just blindly trust what your little systems, your appetitive systems are going to want to do, right? Otherwise, all you would do is eat chocolate and watch porn all day just to feed your sort of short-term reward systems. So I absolutely agree that you don't want to trust them completely. On the other hand, again, for some stuff where, especially when I have difficulty consciously thinking of good reasons for why I should do X, Y, or Z as opposed to A, B, or C, then I'm more likely, I'm happier to go with my gut. And, this corresponds a little bit to what people like Danny Kahneman and others have talked about, which is that, if you're an expert in something, then you should go with your sort of rigorous reason-based system. But if you're not, then sort of you might be better off just going with whatever your intuitions are telling you.
And we should, as long as we're on this subject, although we're about out of time, I should say that near the end of the book, you actually do an extended analysis of kind of moral discourse and value systems. That is, I think it's fair to say, fairly cynical, right?
Yeah, so other people have described my moral view as cynical, and that's because my sense of people's moral commitments is that they're driven by self-interest as opposed to principles. And sort of during the course of this conversation, I talked a little bit about abortion, and I think lots of other moral views are like that too, where people are deriving their moral commitments from what moral world would be good for them to live in, and then they just spin it as principled in some way or another, even when that principle conflicts with some other principle. And of course, this is why I'm plugged into hypocrisy as an important point, which is that people live in these worlds in which they're trying to sell a story about what other people should do, that is what the moral rules ought to be, and then they do whatever's good for them. And I think many people take that as a pretty cynical kind of worldview. Okay.
All right. Well, listen, thank you, Rob. Again, I very much encourage people to read the book, which, in addition to being very interesting, is written in crisp and humorous fashion. Congratulations on it.
Thank you.
And now I will let whichever module is writing your next book resume control of your consciousness.
Well, thanks, Bob. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.